Hello, I'm Connie Mulligan, and I'm going to be talking about negotiating an academic position today. I've been a professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Florida for 17 years now, and I'm the current president of the American Association of Anthropological Genetics. So I want to tell you a little bit about my background so you know where I'm coming from in terms of applying for and getting academic positions. I did my PhD at Yale, not in anthropology, but in the hard sciences, specifically tRNA splicing in yeast. When I started grad school back in 1983, there were no molecular genetics programs in anthropology, so that simply wasn't an option. After grad school, I did about 10 years of postdocing at the Smithsonian, both in Panama and up in DC, and then at NIH for a while, which is where I started my research in human genetics that I continue today, and that informs how I think about getting academic positions. So this is actually the first webinar our department has had, and also that AAAG has hosted. We have solicited questions online prior to the webinar, so I've worked in answers to all of those questions in what I'm going to be presenting now. And then afterwards, we're going to get questions from our in-person audience here at UF, and then anybody who's participating online. So basically, I'm going to talk, and then we'll have time for questions afterwards. So I'm going to talk briefly about applying for an academic position and then interviewing for one. The bulk of the talk is going to be focused on negotiating an academic position, and then I'll follow up with just a few thoughts on how to have a successful first year and beyond in an academic position. So when you start applying for an academic position and you're looking at all the job ads that are out there, you have to sort of think about what your philosophy is in terms of what you apply for. Do you have a kind of targeted approach, or is it more scattershot? My recommendation would be to make it targeted, because getting an academic position is all about fit. The fit of what you have done and can do with what the department is looking for. So departments will often agonize over the exact wording of a job ad, the criteria of the person they're looking for, the exact wording of the position announcement. So once the ad and the hiring priorities are agreed on, it makes it very difficult, very unlikely that someone who doesn't fit those priorities will be hired, even if you're amazing, even if you have all the grants and all the science and nature papers in the world. So what you want to do when you're applying for a position and when you're writing your cover letter and making all your application materials is read the ad really carefully, and you want to copy specific language from that ad that illustrates the fit between what you've done and what the department wants you to do or wants someone to do. So for instance here, medical anthropology, obviously they're looking for a medical anthropologist. It's even mentioned twice here. You also want to be able to say that your research integrates multiple perspectives on health and illness, that you have an empirical field research component to your research program. If you're not doing field work, it's unlikely you're going to be a good fit for this position. Also say something about how you can participate in the global health initiatives across campus, and that would also imply that you would have researched what those global health initiatives across campus are, so that after using this exact wording, you could then list some of these initiatives you might be involved in. It says a focus on Africa is preferred. That means they're pretty much only going to hire someone who works in Africa, because again, lots of discussions have taken place to decide and agree and vote on wanting to hire an Africanist. So in this case of writing a cover letter, it's actually a good idea to actually lift language from the job ad. And sometimes job ads will have maybe a half dozen different areas that, they're hoping someone can, participate in those research areas. And then I might even suggest specifically saying, my research covers 4 out of 6 of the priorities that the department is looking for, and then maybe list them again, to illustrate the fit you have with the department. The materials requested, it's generally always the same, but just a few quick thoughts on putting those materials together. So most everyone is, you're going to write a cover letter. They might ask for separate research and teaching statements, or say it can be included in the cover letter. I would say it's almost better to have separate statements, because then you can more specifically say what you're going to do. In terms of teaching, make specific reference to faculty and courses that are taught in the department, and say, you know, I would also be able to cover teaching these courses in addition to developing additional courses that, you know, integrate well with the department's focus on Latin America, methods, you know, whatever it is. If you've never taught a course, it's really difficult to write a teaching statement. Most likely you will write a teaching statement that screams, I've never taught a course. So what I would suggest in that case is take a weekend or take a couple days and actually design a course from start to finish. Pick a textbook, title your course, write a whole syllabus where you fill out every day of a semester, so that then the department can look at it and say, oh, this course sounds pretty cool. It'd be nice to hire someone who could teach this course. Then you're going to include a CV and look for ways to, you know, add extra information, particularly like in your list of publications. Maybe if this is true, add like a little sub-bullet under the publication that lists the number of downloads or sites of your article, or the impact factor of the journal, or if you've been interviewed for that paper. And, you know, maybe as a, you know, fresh out of grad school student, you don't have any of this, but keep it in mind for the future. Even if it's just, you know, a CV that you post on a departmental website once you're faculty there. Then finally, you're going to give names and addresses to people who will be contacted only if the department hiring asks for letters. But you just want to make sure that your letter writers are all prepared. So you're going to send them links to all of the jobs you've applied to. You're going to send them at least some of your application material so that they have plenty of material to include in their letter. So one of the questions that came in beforehand was asking what the process is, the procedure for looking through applications. So I thought I'd go through that briefly. After the application deadline has passed, the search committee will read through all of the applications, and they'll then identify candidates to request letters of recommendation from. After the letters are in, the committee will then read all of the letters and identify a short list of candidates to present to the department to vote on, to invite to the campus for an interview. So departments will differ in how involved the committee is versus the department. So what I've just described is generally what we do here at UF, but there might be votes taken on the exact wording of the position announcement. There might be votes taken on the list of candidates to ask for letters. Everyone in the department might read all the applications, or they might just rely on the search committee to do that. So it really kind of varies by department. It also varies by faculty members. Some are much more involved than others, but this is generally the process up to this point. So after a list of candidates to be interviewed is agreed upon, then the office staff generally sets up the logistics of it. And then there will be a combination of the office staff and the search committee that will then set up interviews of people for you to meet. And you can always request people you'd like to meet. Shows initiative, shows that you've researched the department. Then after the interviews, the department will meet again and discuss all the candidates and their interviews, and then vote on who to hire. And they'll come up with a list, a ranked list, you know, number one on down through the candidates. And once negotiations start, generally the department's going to stick with that number one candidate until it becomes clear that no agreement can be made, you know, on the startup package. All right, so interviews. It can be scary. You know, you're gonna have to give a seminar. Maybe you have to teach a class. You're gonna be meeting with faculty from the department, maybe somebody from the dean's office. And what you wanna do is you wanna do your homework. You wanna be really prepared for this interview. So you want to research everybody you're going to be meeting with. And to do that, you then need to ask for a copy of their schedule. Try a week ahead of time. They might say, oh, we don't have your schedule yet. You know, say, okay, well, can you send it to me when you do have it? Even if they only send you a partial schedule, that still gives you an idea of at least some of the people you're going to be meeting with so that you can research them. So when I've gone on interviews, I just print out a page on everybody and put it in the order of my interview so that I can just cycle through those sheets and, maybe scribble something, question I want to ask. Because when you're in the interview, you're going to be too nervous to think well on your feet. So all this stuff needs to be done ahead of time. You also want to practice your seminar multiple times. Do not ever say you're going to wing it. That is a recipe for disaster. And if you go over it and there are a couple of really tough spots, be honest with yourself. Those are the ones you really have to go back and practice. Practice to your lab, to some department student organization, to friends, whatever. Maybe even write a script. I know when I applied for my job here, I had an absolute script. Word for word, I even had, advanced slide. Because that's the type of person I am. I didn't want to leave anything to chance. Then also practice answering questions, because that's where, things can really, get a little rough. That's when you really don't think well on your feet. And have your own list of questions for the interview. So as you're going through your interview and meeting with people, think of things that you want to say to people and then questions you want to have. You want to know what your teaching responsibilities would be if you were hired and how much freedom you'd have to develop your own courses. If you're going to have a lab, you want to have some idea of the lab space. Ideally, you're going to actually see the lab space and some idea of startup funds. Ask what kind of grad student support there is in the department and how many graduate students each faculty member typically gets. Something about tenure and promotion criteria. What are you going to be expected to do in order to successfully get tenured and promoted? So things not to bring up. I would typically advise not to bring up salary, startup funding, or spousal hires during an initial interview unless you've got specific reasons for bringing them up. Like if not being able to have some sort of spousal hire is a deal breaker as far as you're concerned. And if you've heard that for spousal accommodation in the department where you're hiring, it might be a good idea to bring it up early. Or if you suspect that the startup package is going to be too small to support the research you need to do, you might want to bring that up. I would still suggest bringing it up in a sort of mild, non-deal breaker kind of way, unless it really is a deal breaker. You can also ask general questions about the teaching load and support for graduate students and stuff like that to get kind of a general feel for how well funded the department is. Okay, so you've been offered the job. So this means that you did a good job picking which positions to apply for. Your research and teaching represents a good fit with the department. You delivered a successful interview, and you've been offered the job. So now you've got to switch gears and think about how to prepare for a successful academic career. So to a certain extent, how well you negotiate may determine how successful your career is, how able you are to deliver the publications, grants, teaching, evaluations, whatever, when you're coming up for tenure and promotion. When I was first applying for jobs, for academic positions, my postdoc advisor at the time told me, make sure you get what you need to succeed. And I thought, well, why wouldn't they give me what I need to succeed? Don't we both want me to succeed? And that obviously was a bit naive. Sometimes they'll try to lowball you, but oftentimes they honestly won't know. The department won't know what you need to succeed, particularly if you're a geneticist moving into an anthropology department as the first ever geneticist like I was. Okay, so for me, I would always start out assuming the best. Start out assuming that you are coming into a functional collegial department and that you can negotiate a situation where it's win-win on both sides. If that turns out to be a little too Pollyanna-ish, you can always change your strategy and maybe think twice about entering a department that may be dysfunctional, if it's actually that extreme. So what's negotiable? This was a big question that came up a lot. From a certain perspective, pretty much everything is negotiable. But the big things that are negotiable are salary, your teaching load, lab space, and startup funding. What's typically not negotiable? So a 9 versus 12-month appointment. At state universities, virtually all liberal arts and sciences faculty are on 9-month appointments, unless we have some sort of service appointment, like you're directing a service lab or something like that, then that might be a 12-month appointment. These are not typically negotiable at state universities. At private universities, it can be very different. So all of my experience comes from working at a state university. Private universities are much freer to do whatever they want. But so this idea of having a 9-month appointment, you can also usually teach during the summer, but that's not generally something you would want to negotiate. Just inquire to see if there are possibilities to teach during the summer, and then when you're hired, do it, or when you get there, do it. Buying a home. So this was something that came up a lot. The idea of if there would be funds to help you purchase a home or help you sell the home you were moving from. So generally not. There are exceptions. California, New York City, places that real estate is really expensive, or possibly if you are negotiating a very high level position. So some of the exceptions, like I said, California or New York, you might be able to negotiate some funds. You might be able to use a portion of your startup budget as a down payment on a house. I know this is sometimes done in California, or get on a list of faculty supplemented housing. This is not uncommon in New York City. And then finally, another thing that is typically not negotiated is something like kids' tuition. So it used to be much more common that at state universities, tuition would be waived for you and all family members. This doesn't happen anymore, not at state universities. It is fairly common at private universities, where they might offer tuition for your kid if your child goes to that university, or even the same amount of money wherever they go. So in that case, it would be something negotiable. All right, so in terms of negotiating, you want to set your priorities. You want to start with the most important stuff, the biggest stuff. Don't think, well, I'll start small to sort of get a feel for it. Start with the stuff that is most important for you to have to be successful there. So I would not recommend starting with, what is probably only ever going to be a couple $1,000s in moving costs. That would generally be at the bottom of my list. Salary, yes, salary is important, but if you run a lab like I do, that comes first and then comes salary. If you're not in that situation, then salary may in fact be the very first thing you negotiate. So set your priorities, figure out what the most important thing is, and start the negotiating there. If you're running a lab, from my perspective, that's going to be your priority. So first, you need lab space. Ask to see the lab space. Ask if there are multiple labs available. If your lab is going to be built or renovated, get a timeline on how long it's going to take. I can't tell you how many friends I have who moved into anthro departments and was told that their lab would be built, and now, over a decade later, still no lab. So I can't emphasize enough that you really want to get in detail what your lab is going to be like. If you look at the space and you say the space really isn't going to work, tell them. You are the expert on what you need to do to succeed in your research program, and it really is your responsibility to tell them what will or won't work. And if a lab is completely not going to suit your needs, you need to tell them. All right, next, startup budget. So startup budget for a lab or any research program is everything you need to do your research. They're hiring you to do the research you've been doing. They want you to continue doing that research. So you may need to educate them on what you need to do, what you need in order to continue doing the research that has them so excited they want to hire you. So obviously, equipment, supplies, a lot of the research I do requires going out in the field and collecting samples. So that to me is something you put in a startup budget. If I need $50,000 to go in the field 2 years and collect samples in order to, create the foundation for my research, then that's something that goes in a startup budget. You can also ask for funding for grad students, postdocs, technicians, again, if this is what you need to do your research. Conference travel. So I recommend making a very detailed list of all of those things. So my startup budget here at UF was pages long, single spaced. Sometimes I included, product numbers for the centrifuge or the Revco I wanted. I included the price, if there was additional shipping, if there was, a service contract, I put all that in. If I wanted student, support for a grad student, I said, stipend plus tuition times how many years. Postdoc or technician, same thing, salary times how many years. What happens is this list justifies your budget. You can't say, I need $200,000 cuts, right? You say, I need $200,000 because that's what all this stuff costs. So when I negotiated the position here, I was the first geneticist to come into the department, and I negotiated with a former chair of ours, Alan Burns, and he actually said that I made it very easy for him to go up to the dean's office and say, Connie Mulligan needs this much money, and here's why. So make the list as detailed as possible, don't leave anything out, and put a little extra in so that you have some negotiating room. You have some stuff that you can give up. All right, teaching. So you always want to try and negotiate down your teaching responsibilities, hopefully for the first year, maybe one course per semester for the first year you're there, to give you time to establish your research program. And so you always want to make it clear that all these things you're asking for are so that you can do the research that they're hiring you for, not because you're lazy or don't want to teach a lot, but this is what you need to do in order to establish your research program. So a couple of creative ways to think about reducing a teaching load might be, if you have a lot of undergraduates or graduate students working with you who are then registering for independent course credit, you could say that, half dozen students equals one course. You could also think about designing some sort of lab class if you want a lab for your students and for any other students in the lab, in the department, who are interested in learning something about the techniques you do, and have that count as a class. All right, so salary. How to decide what you need in terms of salary. Again, you got to do your research. You got to figure out what the cost of living is there. You got to look at one of those cost of living comparison calculators. Whenever I've been involved in trying to recruit someone to UF, I always use those cost of living comparison calculators to our advantage because it's so much cheaper to live in Gainesville than any place else. So you can say the $50,000 we're offering you is like $90,000 in Atlanta. And to a certain extent, it's true. But in this case, you want to do the homework so that you know how the salary compares where you're living now to where you're thinking about moving. Look at state income tax. We don't have any in Florida. It's a nice perk. So you need to research everything you need to know in order to figure out how much money you think you need to live. All future raises will be based on your starting salary. So T&P bumps, merit raises, everything is a proportion of your current salary. If you go someplace else, it's probably going to be based on what you're currently making. So it's important to get that first number good. All right, so when you get really into the negotiating, it is not they make an offer and you say, I'd like this, and then it's over. There's lots of back and forth, so be ready for it. Give and take, give up something, ask for something else, be clear about exactly what you want. Be ready for this back and forth, and it could go on for a while. My negotiations at Florida went on for over a month, really. So be ready to give something up, like conference travel or moving expenses if you get more salary or more in your startup budget. And you also have to know what you want and say it. You can't say, that's not enough. You want to say, oh, I also need money for a postdoc for 2 years, or I also need money for 2 years in the field, and here's an itemized budget of what it's going to cost. So Be very proactive in saying what you need and why, so that you can say, yes, I want to come to work in your department. You can even ask for a second visit. You know, if it feels like negotiations are progressing, that things are going well, but you know, you're really wondering, do I need this? Do I need that? Do I remember what the lab looked like? Ask for a second visit. Maybe you want to bring your significant other so that you can both see what it'd be like to live there, have another look at the facilities, have a look at the lab. It's a chance to get creative and buy yourself some time. Like if the lab space isn't right, say, I noticed a little unoccupied space around the corner there. Does that happen to be anthro space? You know, lots of things can happen just because you come back for a second visit, because that first visit was very different, right? You hadn't been offered a job, you were interviewing, you were very nervous, your head was in a very different space. So a second visit can really be a good idea. All right, so bottom line, don't be unreasonable, but don't be afraid to negotiate firmly. Ask for what you want. The department committee has met and voted to offer you the job. It is highly unlikely that they will move to the next candidate unless negotiations really fall apart horribly. As long as you're respectful, professional, collegial, things can keep moving on for quite a while, longer than you might think. But recognize when the department has offered you as much as they can. You know, so talk to other people in the department, just talk to other people, mentors, you know, to get kind of a reality check if when they say this is all we can offer you, if it's really true or not. So I got this question a couple times. What's a reasonable offer for a salary in startup? And there's no single answer. For salary, it really depends on where you're going to be living. Yeah, high, low cost of living. I mean, you need to figure that out. In terms of the startup budget, it might depend on if there's other equipment that can be shared. And shared equipment is fine so long as you can talk to the people that you're going to be sharing equipment with to make sure they realize they're going to be sharing equipment with you. Again, a little reality check. You know, and startup obviously depends on the kind of research you do. So with genetics research, if you're someone who is all computationally based and you're not going to have a wet lab, you're not actually generating data, you just need a computer lab, your startup budget might be in the range of $50,000. If instead, like me, you have a wet lab and you're generating data, we're talking at least hundreds of thousands of dollars, low hundreds of thousands of dollars, just to give you kind of a ballpark. Some departments won't know that. Well, you know, they literally might advertise for someone that they don't know how expensive it is to get them. And then, you know, there might be a little process and whether or not it works really is going to depend on how much money the college office has authorized for a startup budget, most likely. In terms of salaries, check out salaries of other faculty in the department. Salaries in some states like Florida are a matter of public record. You can see what everybody in the department makes. And again, use your startup list to tell you what's reasonable. Ask colleagues or mentors for startup lists that they use to negotiate a package when they were hired. So what if the final offer is ultimately too low? So you're the only one who can decide that. So you have to ask yourself if you can do the research you want and are presumably being hired to do with the lab and startup funds that they're offering. And can you live the life you want or would like to live with the salary they're offering? And if the answer is no, and if you're sure you're not being unreasonable, then you walk away. So two of my grad students walked away from offers, in both cases because they thought that the startup package was really not even close to what they needed to do to set up the research program they were hired for. They both went on to get better jobs. One had to wait a year, but so don't be afraid to walk if you honestly think you can't be successful with what's being offered. So if you decide to walk away, you tell your main contact first, probably the departmental chair, as soon as possible, and tell that person first. And maybe even say, what's the protocol? Should I contact other people or will you? Email is fine. You can do this in an email. And it's even fine to say that the reason you're not coming is because the money just wasn't enough, if that's the real reason. But you also want to emphasize, that you're disappointed, we couldn't come to an agreement here. You want to email any other colleagues who were involved in the process, who are friends and, you want to tell personally. And again, be respectful and collegial because you want to stay friends with everybody. You may work with some of these people in the future. You may already be working with them. They may come back with another counteroffer, but don't count on it. If you make the decision to walk, you have to be ready to walk. All right, so here's a question that came in. When and how is it appropriate to bring up a spousal hire? So like I said before, the general advice is to wait until you've been offered the job and negotiate a spousal hire as part of your hiring package. The downside is that you've wasted a lot of time if there's no chance for spousal accommodation. So maybe if you get a second interview or if you're feeling really good during the first interview, you could kind of ask if the university or the department or the college supports spousal hires, but say it's not a deal breaker, unless it is. I mean, if it's a deal breaker, then it might make sense to bring it up front. So these days, a spousal hire is typically temporary, maybe like say 3 years, after which period the department or center or wherever your spouse is then gets to decide if they want to look into making an offer for a permanent tenure track type position. All right, another question. What are some of the differences between negotiating a non-tenure track and a tenure track position? So it used to be that most non-tenure track positions were teaching positions, but it's now become much more common for non-tenure track positions to also be research positions. So if it's a research position, you need to ask exactly what the expectations are, how you're going to be evaluated, and how your efforts will be rewarded. In other words, you need to know exactly what is going to be expected of you to succeed. For teaching, you obviously want to get specifics on the courses you're going to be expected to teach and see if there's any flexibility in developing courses that you're interested in teaching that are based on your research expertise. Also ask if you're going to have service responsibilities and make sure that those responsibilities aren't too onerous. What you don't want is where the department has dumped all the service that nobody else in the department wants to do on this brand new non-tenure track line they've got. That could definitely be something that would be negotiable, negotiating down the level of service responsibilities you have. You also want to ask about your ability to advance. Is there a promotion process for assistant in research to associate in research? Ask about the term of the appointment. 1 year is typical, but we're now seeing more multi-year contracts. So you need to decide if that's something you want, if you actually want to be committed to multiple years instead of just a single year contract. And to some extent, all of these things are negotiable. And get everything in writing, everything, non-negotiable. Every little point. You'll always hear horror stories about people who got offered a position, negotiated everything, and everything felt very friendly, and then they showed up, and they said, oh, where's my this? And it's like, I don't, what do you mean? Who said you're getting that? So get it all in writing, and again, if they send you a contract, oh, we've agreed on all the particulars, here's your contract, just sign it and get it back to me as soon as possible so we can set up a position. Read through it and do not be afraid to send it back and say, looks great, but could you add the following? All right, and then have a list. Even give them the wording you want. All right, again, if these things are done respectfully and friendly, it's not going to harm anything, and it's only going to help you to have it all in writing. And then they also know that, you're kind of a force to be reckoned with there, right? Okay, so that's what I had to say about negotiating for a position. Now I just want to say a little bit about, your first year and beyond once you've got this position. So it's never too soon to start thinking about tenure and promotion. I mean, from day one, not, oh, I'll be here a couple of years and see, how things are going. You want to know from the beginning what you will need to get tenured and promoted. So read your department and college T&P guidelines so you know what's expected. Look over previous T&P packets from people in the department who were successful to see what counts. Think about your activities in terms of how they relate to the T&P packet. So when I got here to Florida, I looked at, the T&P packet because that tells you what you enter, right? If you can't find a place to enter something you've done, that sort of means that it doesn't count, right? I mean, there's a miscellaneous section, but you don't want to be putting stuff in the miscellaneous section. So I looked at that, and so I really used that as a guide. If I was thinking about a new project, new committee, or, I would evaluate pretty much everything I did in terms of, will it go in my T&P packet or not? And that's not to say that I didn't do anything if it didn't go in the T&P packet, but I at least was aware that if I was doing it, I was doing it for some reason other than that it would help me get T&P. Most departments will have you submit an annual activities report every year. And so it's a good, what I do is I keep that document open with track changes on. So whenever I do something, I just add it. Get a paper published, give a talk, student graduates, I just put it in there so that then when it comes time to be due, I'm almost done in terms of, having it complete, and there's less chance that I'm going to forget something I did. Get a mentor or lots of mentors. Maybe your department has a mentoring program, which is great, but that doesn't mean you can't get more mentors. Or if your department doesn't have a mentoring program, you can still go up and ask someone, would you be my mentor? Pick someone, obviously, who's successful, who you think you could have a good relationship with, who will give you, criticism when it's needed. Maybe someone who's not at the university, just as a reality check, of what it's like someplace else. So a question that came in, how do you recruit students and postdocs when you're just starting out? So how do you evaluate candidates, and how do you convince them to come to you as opposed to someone who's much more established? So first of all, advertise. When I first got here, I sent out an advertisement for PhD students to apply to Florida. I worded it not just to come work with me, but I also didn't do it as big as the whole department. I did it for the bioanthro field. So I listed all of our faculty in bioanthro and what we specialized in and said, we're looking for great grad students. I have no idea if it was successful, but I made some effort to recruit and advertise grad students, and always advertise for. Then you want to interview, at least by Skype or in person. If it's a grad student you really want or a postdoc, you can use your startup funds to use this. I think it'd be money well spent. I've never hired a postdoc that I haven't interviewed personally. It's usually like $200 or $300 plane ticket. I have them stay at my house, so it's relatively cheap. But for me, I need that in-person, meeting to make a decision about if I want to spend my money, because I'm pretty, frugal, pretty stingy. I want to make sure the money's well spent. So building a productive and harmonious lab is important. You want to think about how people get along. I've asked people to leave my lab because they were kind of disruptive. When I worked in the lab, I wanted to want to spend time there. And the only way that's going to happen is if it's a place you like being. Some other thoughts about your strengths relative to a more established lab. So you have more time to spend with your students. You have firsthand knowledge of the current job market. You've got startup funding. You might actually be in a better position in terms of funding than a more established research because you've got the startup funding. Your research is innovative and exciting, obviously, because it's what got you hired. And give students the freedom to develop their own projects. So these are some ways to you know, get a student to come with you as opposed to somebody else. And I'll just have a few comments on work-life balance, because this is something that comes up a lot. So in my lab, I've got students both in our anthropology department and in our genetics and genomics program here at UF, and I was coordinator of that program for a while. So everybody's always concerned about getting a good work-life balance. So important for me is knowing how my time is spent. To me, I can't figure out how to have a good balance if I don't know how I'm spending my time, work, home, family, friends, all that kind of stuff. And I'm kind of a quantitative person, so I maybe know how my time is spent down to the hour, because I want to know. Make lists of goals, daily, weekly, semester, 5-year, whatever, and then evaluate how good you are at meeting those goals. If you aren't meeting the goals, figure out why you're not meeting the goals. Maybe your goals are unrealistic. Maybe you're not doing the things you need to do to meet the goals. But for me, you know, this goal setting and then evaluating is really critical to be successful. Maybe get together a group at your university of other anthro faculty or junior faculty, or maybe a mix of junior and senior faculty, or maybe all women, or maybe all men, or whatever, so that you meet regularly and just hash out things. You know, oh, I'm having a real problem with this grad student or this faculty member. Just have, you know, a bit of a sounding board. Find an activity that relaxes and rejuvenates you. To me, the rejuvenating part is more important than the relaxing. You know, you want to do something so that you actually want to get up the next day and go to work, bottom line. How to make it work with kids. I'll say just a little bit about this. So I raised 3 kids while I was here at Florida. When I first got here, they were little, all, you know, preschool. And I needed to have some kind of rubric. And so my rubric was they spent more waking hours with me than anybody else. And, you know, I would probably leave lab every day and calculate in my head, you know, what the running total was so that I could modify it. But to me, that's what worked. And it also gave me a very keen sense of how my time was being spent. Personally, I also limit travel. I don't go to many conferences. I really scrutinize if I'm asked to give a talk, because travel is just incredibly disruptive, both personally and professionally. You don't just have the time you're away. You've got all the time spent preparing for whatever it is you're doing before you're gone. And then after you come back, you've got all the time spent digging out from under all the stuff you didn't get done while you were gone. So for me, limiting travel is also key to staying sane. And then finally, you know, if what you thought you were going to do isn't working, you're going crazy, you feel like you're all out of balance, change your mind. You know, nothing's written in stone, nothing's precedent setting. You can just say, I'm going to try something else. And so with that, thank you for your attention, and I'm very happy to take questions. And I think we're going to take questions from our in-person audience first, and then go to our online presence. And I just wanted to say, so we've got a lot of people online, at least in theory. We've had people register from South America, Europe, China, in the US, all the way from Washington, all the way over to Yale. So I'm very happy to take any questions.
I have a question.
Yep.
I've read or I've seen headlines that it's harder for women to get by in the workplace because they have a harder time negotiating their salaries and that sort of thing. Do you have any advice or any insight into that process, the differences between men and women in that process?
So I have so the question was if it's more difficult for women to negotiate a position. I have certainly heard that women are less likely to go out and get other job offers so that they can look for a counter offer at their home institute, that women are less likely to ask for a little bit of extra money. I don't personally know if it's true. What I would say is fight against it. You know, say, how about another $5,000? Or, you know, so I actually have applied for jobs outside of UF and been offered and gone through the whole offer, counter offer process. It ended up being an incredibly positive experience for me. what before had been really scary, and it's like, is it just going to be some kind of game of chicken, right? Who blinks first? Will the university say, oh, great offer, Connie, good luck in your new position? There are a lot of unknowns, but I would say don't not do it because you're scared. Don't not ask for the extra money because you think they're going to pull the offer. That is extremely unlikely to happen. They're not going to say, oh my God, Connie wants another $5,000. Let's go to the next candidate. That just doesn't happen. Unless I've been just a pain throughout the entire negotiating process.
So I've got a couple of questions that have come in from our online presence. One of the first questions that we received was, why would you not discuss salary during the interview process?
At least in academia, it's generally not done. So that's the first reason you wouldn't do it, because you're going to stand out as being, unusual, and that you brought up salary. They haven't decided if they want you. So to me, it just seems premature. Do your research, see what other people in the department are paid, see if you can live with, being at the low end of that, assuming that's where you would start out, and just assume that, that's where the negotiations would lead. So I just don't see any upside to bring it up in an interview, given that that's not the culture in academic hires.
Also a question, how much of this is applicable to postdoc interviewing and hiring?
Okay, postdoc interviewing and hiring. I have certainly gone back and forth with postdoc candidates on salary. That it's certainly negotiable. Research, I'm trying to think of what other things are comparable. A lot of the things just aren't. There's no spousal accommodation. There generally aren't teaching or, service requirements. Moving expenses, I've never had a postdoc ask me to cover moving expenses, but, I guess I'd consider it. I had a postdoc coming from Canada who had to apply for a visa. I think I ended up covering some of those visa costs. Mm-hmm. To me, the things that are necessary for you to do what it is you're being hired to do are fair game. So that's why I sort of put the house expenses off. Yeah, you obviously need to live in a house, but it's not as directly relevant to your job as salary and startup.
And just got this question, and for those with interdisciplinary research focus, do you have advice for applying to positions outside of anthropology? Is this applicable as well, or is that a different approach that you would take?
I would say you need to go back to this idea of fit. You need to look at the position announcement and see how well you fit. So a lot of my students have been very interdisciplinary: genetics, anthropology, public health, in a certain, from a certain perspective, all of those are fair game. Mm-hmm. But you've got to read the ad. If they say PhD in public health required, and you've got a PhD in anthropology, that's not going to work. If it's like PhD in this or that or related fields, that shows there's some flexibility. So those are the ads you want to look at. And ultimately, if you see something that looks interesting and you think you fit, contact the contact person there and, send a CV and say, I'm thinking of applying for this job, but I'm thinking, my anthro background might not be what you're looking for. Can you give me any advice?
And just came in as well. Speaking of, are these tactics applicable outside of anthropology, or are you speaking specifically of negotiating in anthropology?
Oh, I think they're applicable outside, because the world I work in is, anthropology here in liberal arts and sciences, and then genetics, pretty much down to college of medicine, but also genetics is in a lot of the colleges here at UF. So I would say most of what I've said is applicable to positions throughout the departments we've got here. Some of what I've said will be more limited to state universities because I've got very little experience with private universities. Like I said, they're much freer to just, at the end of the day, do whatever they want.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that you helped a postdoc with visas. Is it appropriate to ask to help with citizenship as well for a professor who might be coming in from overseas?
Yeah, because you got to get here and be here. You know, it's something we consider when, you know, we're hiring, you know, what the visa issues are going to be with, you know, bringing somebody over. So I would say that's definitely something you want to bring up in the, you know, the negotiating. I don't think I bring it up beforehand.
So in the negotiating, not in the initial interview per se. I mean, it's going to be known your citizenship.
Right.
So.
Yeah. So I would say that if the department has decided to bring into interviews someone who's not a U.S. citizen, we will have already discussed it at the departmental level, what some of the issues might be getting that person here. So we're not going to go into it blind.
I have no one.
Question?
What happens if you're applying to multiple jobs and you get an offer, but it's maybe not your top choice and you're waiting to hear back from other jobs? How do you deal with the situation?
Okay, so the question was if you're applying for multiple jobs and you've gotten an offer from one, but it's maybe not your first choice, maybe not the best offer, and so you stall. You know, they might pressure you because they might think, oh, you know, we're going to get in there first because we know our offer isn't going to be as good as some will be, so we'll just get her to say yes. You just resist. You know, you're as friendly and collegial as possible. You say, oh, I'm really interested. You know, like I said, suggest the second visit, maybe to bring your significant other, or maybe just to get a second look. You don't tell them, you know, well, I'm really hoping for an offer from Stanford, so could you guys wait a bit? But you find creative ways to draw it out and to, as much as you can, sort of ignore that deadline they told you need to respond by.
Just got another online question, and this is a couple-parter, so I'll throw it out there and let you decide how to work through it. Okay, so how many grad students should you reasonably take on in your first year? Should you only have one and then focus on postdocs or other kind of researchers as you settle in? Also, if you're running a lab, do you try to fill all of the positions right away to get it up and running full steam? Or is this something that you would slowly climb towards hiring one or two positions, taking on?
Okay, so my answer is you want to do it slowly because it is unlikely that in your first year you're going to find multiple awesome grad students, great postdoc, great technician. If you say I'm going to hire all these people by the end of the year, you will probably not be getting the best people. For me, it's always better to get better people and wait. So I would say start with one grad student, you know, so you can spend time with that student, you know, and if you also want to hire a postdoc or a technician in that first year, you know, focus on getting good people. I have advertised for postdocs sometimes where at the end of the day, I thought I had no good applicants. So I'm like, okay, I'm not hiring anybody because I really didn't, I would much rather have nobody than somebody bad. So that's another thing that I forgot to mention. Another thing to negotiate with respect to your startup budget is negotiate how long you have to spend it. It's much easier for the department and the college to say, okay, you got to spend all this money in 1 or 2 years. But it can be really difficult to spend money well, you know, if you've got a hard deadline like that. So I would always argue to negotiate, could I have another extra year, which is what I did here. And then sometimes, you know, creative ways can be found to, you know, spread that money out even longer than what we were originally promised.
And just came in online. How much can or does religion play a role in hiring for a faith-based university? And how much can you negotiate if that isn't a fit for you?
Wow, so the only place I have any knowledge of is Notre Dame. And I know that you don't have to be Catholic to be hired by Notre Dame. If you wanted to go out and speak very publicly about, abortion rights for all, they probably wouldn't be very keen about that there. I don't know, you probably have to be much more circumspect in terms of what you talked about, your personal and professional life. I don't know if that addresses the question at all. It's all private universities, so it comes down to they can do whatever they want.
And I can speak from experience that it has been a deal breaker for me with Southern Baptist institutions and talking about evolution, where they forbid it in class, and I can't work with that.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's their institute, they're paying, they're footing the bills, they get to make rules.
I think that's all we have, yeah.
Okay, well, this is great. Thank you very much, and I hope it was useful.